Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today we're going to talk about the Amazon forest and how they found these human settlements that predate the previously oldest known complex societies, which dated to 2,500 years ago. And just to put that in perspective, 2,500 years ago was about 500 BC. 500 BC, and that was during the Roman Republic, or not even the Roman Empire yet. And that is not that long ago. And the new date that they have for these settlements, these early human settlements, are 10,000, like 8,500 years before that. So about 10,000 years ago or so, that they found these humans living on these islands that we'll talk about in a second. So this comes from Penn State. Humans settled in southwestern Amazonia and even experimented with agriculture much earlier than previously thought. New evidence suggests that humans first settled in the region up to 10,000 years ago during the early Holocene period. So, just to put that in perspective, just think about it this way. At the end of the last ice age, if we assume that there was a culture, an advanced civilization that had some sort of high technology, Younger Dryas happens, a bunch of people die, and they still have this idea that survives. However it happened, we don't know. It could either be in the form of like Stonehenge, like a megalithic site that has astronomical alignments. It could be cave paintings. It could be statues, or a weird network of caves, or some other legacy that they left that still kept these ideas intact. And when I say these ideas, I mean like agricultural societies is a big one, farming techniques, the idea of a religion or like an afterlife or a god. All of these things could be considered these relics, these abstract relics, these not fundamentally non-physical relics of a previous era. And that is a very key thing to understand, is that ideas are, like what Plato said, ideas are the most ideal, or the best, or whatever you want to say, that the longest, the most durable, I guess you could say, form of existence, because ideas don't have a biology. They occupy biological beings, especially intelligent beings, who can conceive of them and apply these ideas or implement them in some way to their life. So it makes sense, or the fact that we see these hunter-gatherers who understandably survive a cataclysm, we see them experimenting with agriculture. So let's go through this article, and I'll try to walk you guys through this. So these group of people were hunter-gatherers. However, our data show that they were beginning to deplete their local resources and establish territorial behaviors, perhaps driving them to begin domesticating plants such as sweet potatoes, cassava, peanuts, and chili peppers as a way to acquire food. Now, territorial behavior, that doesn't happen in hunter-gatherer communities, because there's no concept of territory. There's no property. It's everyone is traveling together and working together and following either migrations or the weather patterns. They're in the most simplistic way you can say is that they were in tune with nature, and they were adjusting on the fly. When you see the forensic evidence, as in like local resources start to get depleted, either you see these middens, which are literally ancient trash piles of the remains of shellfish, animal bones, and the like. You can see that in the record. You can also see geological evidence. There are different layers of the soil. You can test the acidity of the soil and see how much of the nutrients that were depleted and how much came back. So there are all these different ways to see this footprint, that if there were people living at the time, you can see in a sense what they were doing. And that's part of what goes into this research here. And then the other is burials. And on this island, they found these burials, and hunter-gatherers, when someone dies, they bury them around the spot that they died. There aren't no royalty cemeteries, for example, or like commoner cemeteries. There's none of that. There's no tradition or intention of where they bury people. So because of that, they know whether it's a hunter-gatherer population or an agricultural-based population. They found there's these 3 islands, Isla del Tesoro, La Chacra, and San Pablo. So it's located near the surrounding savanna, which floods every season, or seasonally. So it's very predictable. When the rain season comes, you got to get out of the savanna and go to higher ground. And these islands were noticeably elevated above the savanna. So if you were living at that time, and you had knowledge of your surrounding area and your environment, then you would know to go to these islands to seek shelter and live there temporarily until the rainy season stopped. And that's what these archaeologists thought as well. So they thought, okay, this is a suitable place. It seems like a logical place to set up camp. Let's do an excavation. And that's what they did. They excavated those islands. They revealed human skeletons, and they had been intentionally buried in a manner unlike that of typical hunter-gatherers. So again, like I said earlier, that's a hallmark of some subsistence agricultural-based society that is probably indicative of a bunch of other things too, like religion, strict way, some type of way of life that's different from hunter-gatherers. Technology, again, then with that politics and centralized power, and then territorial, a stratified community or society, and basically a political hierarchy is created. So all that comes from, you can extrapolate from this burial. That's how powerful this evidence is. And before this, there was no evidence. So that's why, at the end of the day, once they're all done excavating, which I don't know when that's going to happen, but the more and more land that they excavate and the more and more stuff they find, then it's going to be pretty hard to argue against that there was some sort of civilization that people like Graham Hancock in his new book say supported 20 million plus people. And let me just show you guys a picture, just to give you guys an idea of how big this is. So Peru, Bolivia, Brazil, French Guyana, parts of Venezuela, parts of Colombia and Ecuador. These are all different countries that make up this huge, just biologically diverse and dense area. And here's a better picture right here. It's huge. So it does make sense right away that someone was living here, and not just hunter-gatherers. And now that they know that there are people who were farming here, almost all bets are off now. And now it should just be a race to find as many skeletons as they can. So they had this idea of a complex society 10,000 years ago, characterized by political hierarchy, like I mentioned before, production of food. You guys have to understand that when you're talking about millions of people living in one spot, these are a necessary prerequisite to having a giant populations. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that there was probably some sort of megacity or some giant civilization living off of South America. If these were highly mobile hunter-gatherers, you would not expect for them to bury their dead in specific places. They would leave their dead wherever they died. It is rare to find human or even archaeological remains that predate the use of fired pottery in the region. And they're just going into the soil and the acidity and how they could tell that they were living off of the land and they were using the nutrients of the soil to grow whatever it is that they were living off of. And up until this point, they were basing their conclusions on indirect evidence. It was just geochemical analyses like this soil analysis, but there was no artifacts or anything that they found up until now. So because of this, like I said, they've got to throw out the old paradigm and accept that there were people, not just hunter-gatherers, but there were people who were farming 10,000 years ago, and that means they must have some sort of language, they must have some sort of organization, and all that stuff that comes with it. The current study provides strong and definitive evidence of the anthropocentric origin of these sites because the archaeological excavations uncovered early Holocene human burials. What they found, even though the conditions are very poor to preserve stuff like bones, these middens that I mentioned earlier, they were piled so high that they eventually, over time, water dissolved the calcium carbonate that makes up these shells and these bones, and then it precipitates over the human bones, and then it effectively fossilizes them. The only problem with this is that you can't radiocarbon date it directly. So what they did was they radiocarbon dated the associated charcoal and the shells and other proxies for estimating the time range. So that's how they came up with the date with 10,000 years ago. So that just means that there were people camping there to burn that charcoal 10,000 years ago. If they could have dated the exact fossils, that would have been way more helpful. But since they couldn't, it's like a Göbekli Tepe situation. They could only carbon date what it was buried in. They can't, because you can't carbon date stone. So they know that Göbekli Tepe was there to be buried 12,000, or like however old is this, 12,000 years old or something like that. So this is the same idea. There were people there camping because we checked the charcoal and the wood that they were using, but those people could have easily been there way before. The abundant remains of burned earth and wood suggest that the people were using fire, likely to clear land, cook food, and keep warm during long rainy days. So this suggests to me slash and burn technique. I'm sure you guys have heard of slash and burn, and cooking food. So I mentioned earlier that the Amazon forest is known for its biodiversity and countless numbers of plants that we know about, and even more plants that we don't know about. So there's mixed within them, there's going to be some edible plants and some non-edible. Now, you can only go by trial and error so far until a bunch of people in your tribe die. So they must have known about edible plants from somewhere else. It must have been an idea. Someone must have known and gotten that knowledge from somewhere else. Either way, it's pretty safe to say that this was knowledge that was passed to them and not some haphazard trial and error thing. Just because if you look at the sheer numbers of what's in the Amazon, it's just astronomical that they happened to pick the right ones and learned how to cultivate them and learned exactly how to raise them correctly, and then survived for thousands of years off of that. Same thing with slash and burn. Slash and burn technique is not just you just cut down trees and burn whatever you cut down just so you can enrich the soil and then move on to the next thing. It has to be implemented in a very, very specific way, in a very intentional way. And again, those subsistence techniques had to have been passed down. And again, ideas don't die. Ideas are always there. They just had to be rediscovered. And someone must, when you take into account the story of Göbekli Tepe and the myths of Atlantis and this previous civilization, if you look at this through that scope, it makes a lot of sense that this scenario would come up in the wake of something like the Younger Dryas that would wipe out entire civilizations of people. A gap exists between the people his team studied who lived on the forest islands between 10,000 and 4,000 years ago and the rise of complex societies which began 2,500 years ago. Are the people we found direct predecessors of those later, more complex societies? Now, this is a very interesting question because they know that there are people who have two different types of genetics in South America. One are people who came through the Bering Strait and who are related to the Siberians. And those people who came down from North America to Central America all the way down to either the Amazon or the Andes Mountains, those people are all come from one haplogroup. And then there's another haplogroup that they found that I talked about in my previous videos that come from Melanesians and Samoan people and Austronesians. And those people, there's a theory, and it's that they crossed the Pacific, and these are the same people who were in Easter Island as well. And it's known that they were accomplished sailors, and they are thought to be one of the earliest maritime societies that crossed large swaths of ocean, and they island hopped. So one of the theories is that they crossed the Pacific and they landed either in Chile, or they landed from the southern tip of South America, otherwise known as the Tierra del Fuego, and those people spread into South America that way. And as the theory goes, if that's true, then there are two different haplogroups of people, two different populations of people that entered South America at different times in history. And these people of these early agriculturalists, these early farmers from 10,000 years ago, which haplogroup do they belong to? Are they from the Siberian people, the people who crossed the Bering Strait, the ancient Beringians? Or are they related to the people who occupied Easter Island and Samoa and Austronesia? Those are all questions that need to be answered. So I thought this was very interesting, especially in light of Graham Hancock's new book, America Before, which I highly suggest you guys read. And one of the assertions in that book is that the Amazon forest might have been at one point a garden that was being held stewardship by humans. And if that is true, then that makes a lot of sense about what I said earlier about cooking food and knowing which plant works for what and what works in what medicine. Like ayahuasca is a good example. You need a vine and you need a plant and you need to put them together, and then it creates this unique concoction. And just to discover that by chance the chances of that are so astronomically small that there must have been someone with the preconceived notion or idea or tradition, wherever it came from. It survived the Younger Dryas, and it inhabited these crop of people, these hunter-gatherers, who already by default had the skills to survive a cataclysm, whereas complex stationary society may not have. Just like, think about America now. If America came through something like a Younger Dryas, everything got flooded, or there's a asteroid impact that just wiped everybody out, there's no way people would survive that. Even if you lived in LA and you survived in the aftermath, there's no way that you would have the know-how to survive without electricity and all these things that come with a complex society. So because of what Graham says, the aftermath of a giant garden unchecked is you get something like the Amazon, something so impossibly beautiful that it's just a mind blow that it even exists at all. And that not only are there undiscovered plants and animals and bacteria, microorganisms, there's also undiscovered people that live in the Amazon. I think just recently they discovered a whole new tribe of people that they didn't even know exist. So this whole thing is a mystery. And the fact that they had these ideas, and the fact that it came out that they had farming techniques, is just such a mind blow that whatever they knew beforehand, they just either have to scrap altogether, or they have to adjust the timeline, so much so that the foundations of which they built the history of the Americas have to be grossly altered. So that's about all I have today, guys. Let me know what you guys think about the Amazon, about these tribes, hunter-gatherers, this idea of civilization, these civilizers, who, by the way, Quetzalcoatl seems to have the same parallels as Oannes, or these other civilizing figures in Mesopotamia and Turkey. And it makes a lot of sense that these same bearded figures hold the man bags and all of these different motifs that you see on a global scale, these parallels you see from Europe to the Middle East, all the way to other continents like North and South America and Central America. I don't think it's a coincidence, and I think that there's something bigger here, and that has to do with ideas, the transfer of information, and encoding information to to survive cataclysms and survive long periods of time until a remote population in the future could come back and find this encoded information, and not only find it but make sense of it. And that seems to be the pattern here, that these ancients must have been so advanced just because they had the foreknowledge to encode very important principles of subsistence living on the earth, and this idea of right and wrong, a code of ethics, a code of laws, religion. All of these things come from this genesis of a civilized group of people that could sustain millions and millions of people way back in antiquity. So let me know what you guys think about hunter-gatherers, about all these ideas, Atlantis, whatever it is, and or if you read Graham Hancock's book, you can leave some feedback about that, and I'll talk to you guys later.